Hey everyone, in this video we're going to recreate the live code editor from Chakra UI docs. You may have seen this in documentation for other component libraries as well, where the basic premise is that you have one panel with your code editor and a code snippet with some sample code, and then another panel where the code in that editor gets rendered onto the screen, and you can make changes in real time and see those updates in real time right there on the page. So this will let you not only to share examples of your components and the code to go alongside them, but also give you users a way to try things out right there in the documentation and see how the components interact and try out different combinations of things without having to leave the browser window. So this is really handy for things like component libraries and design system documentation, as it lets you include interactive examples in your docs. We will use Chakra UI as our reference point, and we'll try to mimic the styling that they have in their docs. But the component will be fully customizable, and you can adjust the styling to fit your own brand, and the basic functionality will remain the same regardless of what styling you're going for. We will use a library called React Live for the foundation of our component. And this library will provide a lot of the basic functionality that we'll need, such as the code editor and the preview pane and so on. And then we'll use TailwindCSS for all the styling and to make it look like the Chakra UI docs. Another cool thing about this is if you're using MDX for creating your documentation and kind of generating all the content, you'll be able to put this component right into your MDX files and just provide the code snippet that you want to render, and that's it. So again, it's super handy to use in your documentation platform. All right, so to get started, I've already got my basic Next.js app set up. It's pretty bare bones other than Tailwind. So Tailwind is already installed and configured, but other than that, it's your basic starter template. And so what we're going to be recreating today is the live code editor from Chakra UI docs. So if we go to Chakra UI and check out any of the component documentation pages, you'll see here that when you scroll down to the examples, you've got this editable example here. So you've got a panel with a code editor, and then whatever code you have in here gets rendered up above, right? So you have this live example here. So we can change any of the properties. We can change this to another value, and you'll see the changes get updated in real time. So this is the basic premise of what we're going to recreate. And to do this, we're going to use a library called React Live. So React Live does exactly this for us. As you'll see, there's a couple examples here, but it's essentially a code editor with a panel that renders the code that you write here. And renders it on the side here. So this is exactly what we need. And it will serve as the foundation for our component. Now to get started with React Live, we're going to need to install it as a regular dependency. Let's go ahead and do that. And once it's installed, we're going to copy the starter code that they provide us here. So we're going to copy all of this, and we'll create a new component called a code block for this. So we'll create a new folder called components, and then component called code block. So let's add that here. And let's add our export statement here. All right, so we've got our starter code here. And since we're going to be providing code to this component, let's go ahead and add that as a prop right away. So this component will take in a prop called code, and this code will be the code string that we'll want to render. So rather than this sample that they gave us, we're going to pass the code prop to it. And what this consists of is the several of the components that are provided by React Live. So you've got your live provider. So this is your top level component. So this is essentially your code editor provider. We'll be setting a couple of settings here. Then you've got your live editor itself, live error, which is the error pane, and then live preview, which is the panel where the component will be previewed and rendered. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. And let's add this to our page here. So let's go ahead and say code block. And then for code, let's pass in the code sample that they give us here. And we'll need to import that code block from components code block. All right. Now let's run that. And if we refresh here, oh, you see that we got an error. Oh, so this is an issue with React Live. For some reason, it doesn't install when you run the install command. It doesn't install the actual latest version for some reason. So it's on version 3, I believe, or 3.1. So for some reason, if you don't include that here, it doesn't install the latest one. So make sure that you install with version 3 minimum specified. And that's where this issue will be fixed. All right, so let's run that again. So hopefully by the time you're watching this, maybe this will be fixed. But if not, that's the key. And let's refresh, and there we go. So we've got our first little sample here. All right, so if we go back to our code block component here, we take a look at what we have. We've got our live editor, which is this right here. Right, this is the actual code editor, the error pane. So if we made a mistake here in our syntax, you'll see that an error message gets generated. All right, and then we've got our live preview, which is the actual preview pane. All right, so our code is actually working here. So next, let's go ahead and take a look at Chakra UI and what we actually need to do here. All right, so we'll see that first we want the code panel to be spanning the entire width. And also, rather than being side by side, these two panes will be stacked on top of each other. So our code editor should be on the bottom, and then the preview pane should be at the top. And then I believe, yeah, the error is on the bottom. So let's go ahead and change that in our code here. All right, so first let's put a wrapper around this thing. And we'll make this a flex and flex column. Like so. All right, so now our items are stacked on top of each other rather than being side by side. So first we know that we want our preview to be up top, our editor in the middle, and then the error pane at the very bottom. So because this is a dark background, we're going to want to have a dark theme enabled for our syntax highlighting. And we go back to the documentation for React Live. In their provider, you can see that there's a theme prop where we can pass a theme object from Prism React Render, which is the underlying syntax highlighter that this library uses. And so we can actually specify a different theme for a provider. And there's a number of themes included with Prism React Render that you can actually utilize. So if we go to their docs, you'll see that there's an example of it here. And if we actually go to the source and look at all the available themes, you'll see these are all the ones that are included. So we're going to want to go with VS Dark as our theme. So let's go ahead and copy this here and go back to our code block component. And rather than Dracula, we're going to go with VS Dark as our theme. So we'll have theme here, and then we'll pass that as a prop to the live provider here. All right, so now you see the syntax got updated. One thing we need to do is in the editor, we need to add some extra padding so that the background shows up. All right, there we go. So now we have our dark theme enabled, and we compare it to Chakra UI. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough to start. So we'll go ahead with that. Next, we'll see that we have rounded edges here, right? So we want to have a rounded border. Then we also need a title up above here, editable example. So let's go ahead and make these changes. All right, so we have our live editor. We'll need to wrap it in another div. And in here, we'll add some more extra padding. And we'll say that this will be rounded medium. And because this doesn't have a background, we'll need to provide it a background color. So we want the same background color as on this pre-tag here. And that color comes from the VS Dark theme. So we're actually going to want to go and look into this theme, and we'll see here that we have a background color as this hex value. So let's go ahead, copy that, and come back here, and we'll say background color, and there we go. Now we have a nice matching background color. And then we also have the rounded edges in our panel here. Next, we'll need the center title here. So let's go ahead and add that as well. We'll add another div above that to hold that. So you're going to want to have extra small text. It will also be in uppercase, and it's gray in color. Right, let's see. Yeah, gray, uppercase, extra small probably, and then aligned in the middle. Okay. We'll say editable example. Save that and see how that looks. All right, so we want to have it in bold probably. We'll say font bold. And then we also need to center it. So since we have two elements here, the editable example text and the actual editor itself, let's make the parent container a flex container with flex call as well. And then we'll do the item center, justify center to align it. So that's starting to look pretty good. Not sure if the padding is exactly the same, but that's, it's good enough to start. All right, next, let's go ahead and update the styling for our preview pane. Go back to the Chakra docs. You'll see the preview pane has a gray border with rounded edges around it, and looks like some padding here as well. So let's go ahead and do that. You can add a class name directly on the live preview. And let's say border gray 300. We'll also need rounded edges and some padding. All right, so there we go. We got a border, but we see it doesn't span the full width. So let's give it a full width here, like so. And then we also want to move the code editor slightly below, just so they're not touching edges. So if we look at our editor here, we can say margin top, or sorry, that's the wrong one. We need this one. All right, so that puts a little bit of space between them. Probably actually want a little bit more space. do it margin top 4. Yeah, that's a little bit better. All right, another thing I want to do is see how this spans the entire width of the page. This seems like it's not going to the full width, so let's add a width full here. All right, so the only thing that's left is the code editor, so let's make this width full as well, and there we go. And then we need the actual editor itself, so the pre-tag to span the entire width as well. All right, so there we go. Okay, so now you can see that this works. Next, let's update the styling of our error pane. We'll go back to Chakra and check out their error. So using bright red background, and again, move slightly below the code editor. So let's go ahead and do the same. So for our error, we have a class name. So again, we'll do margin top 4. And then this time we'll do background red. Go 600. And then we also want the text to be white as well. And then let's add some padding. So padding is the same throughout. So let's keep it at E2. And then we also want it to span the full width. So there we go. All right, next we need our copy button here. So you'll see that when you click it, the code gets copied here, and then the text changes to copied for a brief moment as well. So let's add this this button. First, we'll add the visual, and then we'll add the actual functionality of copying the code as well. All right, so for the button, we're going to make it a absolutely positioned element, just because it's going to be easier this way. So then we'll need the parent container. Our parent container, we'll need that to be relative. So let's make that change first. So here, make this relative, and then over here we'll add our button, and this button will have a teal background. So let's say 600. Again, text was white. And then we'll need some padding. So its vertical padding is slightly less than its horizontal. So with that, and then we also need a hover. So on hover, it gets darker. So let's add hover, BG, teal, and let's go with a 700. And one last thing is the text needs to be uppercase. All right. Okay, so we also need the text to be bold, and we want that to be smaller probably. So let's do text font bold, and then text is extra. Okay, that's better. Then we need the rounded edges. So we'll need rounded medium. And then now we want to absolutely position it to the right and to the top. So let's give it a absolute position, and then we'll say top 0, right 0. And that puts it right in the corner. So we probably want to go with top 4 or top 2 and right 2. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. Let's see. Yeah, 2, probably 3. Either one works. All right, so now we've got the button. We've got the button position where we want. Now we want to add the actual functionality, right? The copying itself and also the change of text. Right, to help us copy the code in the editor, we're going to use a library called copy to clipboard. So we'll need to install that. Once you have that installed, we're going to need to make a number of changes here in our code block component. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import a couple of hooks here. So we'll need a use effect and a use state. And then we'll need to create a couple of state variables here. So we'll need an indicator that code was copied, right? So we'll create copied and set copied. Right. So now when we click the button here, we can say on click, we will set copied to true. Right. And then let's say in here, if copied, we'll say copied. Otherwise, we'll say copy. Right. So now if we run this, when I click copy, you'll see the text changes to copied. But we want this to go back to the initial state. And so if we look at Chakra docs here, when you click copy, the text changes to copied for a couple of seconds and then resets back to the initial state. So we want to do the same here as well. And to accomplish that, we'll need to set a timer and enable that timer within a use effect. So we'll want to call this whenever copied changes. Right? And within here, we'll want to do a couple of things. So first, we'll want to copy the code. So we'll need to fill this in later, and this is what we'll use the copy to clipboard library. But then once the code is copied, we want to create a timer for the copied state and then reset it back to the initial. So for that, we can create a timer, and we'll create a timeout using set timeout. And what this will do is it will reset the copied state back to false. But we'll do that after, let's say, 2 seconds, right? And then make sure to return the cleanup function. And within here, we'll say if there's a timeout ID, then clear timeout with this timeout ID. All right, so this ensures that whenever this component is unmounted, the timer is cleared out. All right, so let's save that and try it out. All right, and there you go. So you saw that the copied state changed back to the initial after 2 seconds. And the text was updated depending on which state we were in. Okay, so we've got the copied state figured out, but we haven't actually copied our code yet, right? So in order to be able to do this, we need to get access to the most up-to-date version of the code here. Because initially, what we pass to code block is basically the initial code to display, but a user can edit this code. That's kind of the whole point, right? So if I updated this here, when I click copy, I want to know the actual up-to-date version. So right now, because we're just passing the initial code and nothing else, this component is essentially uncontrolled, right? The editor component itself. So we want to essentially make it a controlled component. And we do that by, well, first instantiating some state variables here. So we'll want the editor code and then set editor code, use state, and then so we'll set the initial value of this to the code prop that was passed in. So we'll manage the state internally within this component now. We'll control the state, but we'll use the code that's passed into it as the initial value. All right, so now when we've got this here, the first thing we want to do is, rather than passing the initial code, we want to pass the state variable instead. All right. And then when our code gets updated, so as you type it in here, we want the state variable to get updated. So to do this, our live editor here takes in an onChange event. We can pass to it a onChange handler. And we can say handle onChange will be a function that we'll create. And let's say here, we'll say handle onChange. And this will take in new code. And we can simply set editor code to this new code. So now whenever we're typing in the editor here, this fires the onChange event, and we grab the new code that gets returned by that event and update it in our state variable. Right? So whenever we type anything in here, this value rather gets updated in our state. So now that we have this value in our state, we can actually use it when we click the copy button. Right? So up above here, copy the code. Right? So here we can use that copy to clipboard library to copy the code to the clipboard and then pass to it the code from the state variable here. All right, so let's go ahead and import it. We'll say copy from copy to clipboard. And then we'll call this function in here. We'll say if copied. So if we're in the copied state, so if the copy button was just pressed, and if there's code in the editor. And so if we're in the copied state and there's editor code available, so it's not empty, we'll say copy editor code. All right, so now whenever we click on copy, the most up-to-date code from the editor will get saved to our clipboard. So let's change this to different value. Press copy. And now you'll see that the new value got copied to the clipboard. All right, so the copy functionality is complete. Now, before we move on, there's one small visual detail that we still need to complete. And that's if you focus on the copy button, you'll see that it gets the browser default outline style. And we want to update that, since if we compare it to Chakra, you'll see that it gets a nice, almost kind of semi-transparent blue outline. So let's go ahead and add that to ours. And for that, we'll just use a default Tailwind example. So if we go to outline style, you'll see that they have some examples here. And we can just use one of the ones that they provide. So over here, let's copy that. And then if we go back to our button, let's add that in here. And then rather than border blue, we'll do border sky. Now, if we save and go to our example here, you'll see that now we get a nice custom outline. All right, well, now if we try to copy the example from Chakra and paste it in our code block here, you'll see that we get an error. So this is expected since button is a custom component. And right now our component doesn't know what the capital case button is, since by default you only have the standard HTML elements included. You don't get any of the custom components that you're probably looking to display here. So in order to be able to do that, first we'll need to add Chakra to our project since we haven't actually installed it yet. And then we'll need to also provide a way for the code editor to actually know what we mean when we say button, like where it should that come from. So first, let's go ahead and install Chakra. And since I'm running a Next.js app, I'll just use this example here. So we'll copy our dependencies. And let's install them in our project. While that's installing, we'll also need to set up the Chakra provider. So this we will add to our main app.js file. You'll see we'll need to import the Chakra provider and then wrap our app component with it. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll import Chakra provider. And then we'll need to add a Chakra provider as the top level component here. All right, so now we can use Chakra components in our project here. But we're still not quite done, since by default, React Live really only lets you use plain React elements. And since Chakra UI is an external component library, we need a way to tell React Live that this is an external dependency and to provide the components that we want to use in here. So to be able to do that, we have a prop called scope on our live provider. And this is where you can provide any other additional globals that you want to have access to in your code editor. So as you can see, by default, it only injects React itself. So that means that if we have any other component libraries or any other code that we want to specify, we'll need to add that ourselves. So let's go ahead and go back to our code block component here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new object called scope. And this will take in our any dependencies that we want to inject. So first, well, we still want to have access to React. So let's import React here. And then we'll also import all of Chakra. We'll import all Chakra components and we'll provide that in our scope here. So first we'll spread React so that this way we can use the built-in hooks without having to write React dot and rather just use the hook names and so on. And then we'll do the same thing with Chakra. So we'll spread all Chakra components as well. So this way we have access to both React and Chakra. And if there was any other additional dependencies that you wanted to have access to here, you would add them in here as well. And then let's just use this variable here, this object rather, in our live provider. So we'll say scope is equal to scope. Okay. And now that we have that, if we save it and refresh, oh, we need to run our project first. Let's do that. All right, so now if we refresh, and let's go ahead and copy an example from the Chakra UI docs. Let's just use this simple one here. And now if we paste it in, we'll see that we have our Chakra button. All right, so this is exactly the same as what we have in the Chakra docs here. You can see we can even go ahead and import this more complex example. Let's copy that, paste that in, and there you go. You'll see that get updated immediately. So we get access to all the Chakra components in here. All right, now there's one last thing left that we need to do still. And you may have noticed a slight red flag here where we're importing all of Chakra into a single variable here. As well as React and anything else that may go into our scope. And this means that the entirety of the Chakra library will be included anytime we have this code block component on our page. So if we go into our network tab here And let's reload the page here. Notice the size of the index file here. So our index is our page where this is being used, right? Over here. And if you look at the size of the index file, it's 488 kilobytes for really just a small amount of code here. So this means that anytime we use code block, we automatically get all of Chakra and any other dependencies that we include in the scope here loaded at the initial load of the page, which is pretty heavy-handed. And right now we only have Chakra as a dependency, but what if you had another library that you wanted to use? That means that you would have to include that entire library as well. And that's not really a great experience. We don't want to have that initial large page size on the initial load. So we need to fix this. And one way to do this, since we're using a Next app, Next has this dynamic import component, which allows us to dynamically import anything rather than doing it on the initial load. Next will defer that and load the component asynchronously, or any piece of code that you want to import asynchronously. And this will allow us to essentially code split our app and have it so that rather than having the entirety of code block dependencies being included in that initial payload, we'll load just our basic page, and then any dependencies specified using this dynamic component, they'll be loaded as a chunk following the initial page load. So let's do that. Rather than having code block imported like this, we'll say code block dynamic, and this takes in a function that will then return the import promise of the code that we want to include. So we'll say code block like so, right? And now if we save this and let's reload our page over here, look at the size of index now, right? We went from almost 500 kilobytes down to 24. And then also notice how we now have a separate code chunk here called components code block. So this is essentially Next offloading the import of code block as a separate chunk, so that we still have the overall size hasn't changed, but this means that this piece of code will be loaded after the initial page load, and that means a nicer experience for our users. So we could have things like loading spinner, and let that be handled asynchronously, which in turn keeps your application performant and provides you a much better Web Vitals score. All right, and now that we have this change here, we are basically done. You have your code block component that you can reuse in any of your projects. You can adjust it to your own branding, but the basic functionality will remain the same. All right, now up until this point, we've just been using inline JSX in our code editor. But what if we wanted to have more complex examples? For example, what if we wanted to use some React hooks or have several different components defined and kind of compose them together? Well, you can do that as well in React Live with a slight change. So what we'll have to do is specify the no inline prop, and rather than putting the JSX inline like we have here, you would then call the render method with the component that you want to display. So we'll take a look at the live provider. They have the no inline prop. And if we want to use the other approach, we'd have to set this to true. So let's go back to our code here and add that one last little change. So in our code block component here, let's add this prop in here as well. And since the default is a falsy value, we can just leave it as is. And then scroll down to our live provider. And then here we'll set no inline to no inline. Right now, whenever we want to use that other pattern using the render method, all we have to do is pass no inline equal to true to our code block here. And then if we go back to our index file, we'll need to add the no inline prop here. And since it's just a Boolean, we can leave that this way. You'll see that we have an error here because we're not using the render function. So what does this let us do? Well, let's say rather than having this inline, let's create a functional component. So we'll do const my button is equal to an arrow function. And you'll see the editor jumps around here a little bit, the cursor in the editor rather. It's a little bit annoying, but I haven't been able to figure out why this happens. I think this just might be an issue with React Live itself at this moment. But anyway, we'll work our way around that. But for now, let's create some internal state here. So we'll do a boring old counter example. We'll have count, set count. And now because we've spread React over our scope, rather than writing React dot, we can simply use the hook names directly. And we'll say use state going to be equal to 0 to start, right? And then in here, so we'll say return our button. And rather than showing the button text, we'll show the value of count. And then also let's add an on click where this will increment the count by 1 anytime you click it. We'll say set count to count plus 1. All right, and let's close up the function here. And now we can simply say render my button. All right, and now we've got our button with 0 to start. And when we press, we'll see the counter incrementing. Right, so you'll see here that we can use any of the React hooks in here. It pretty much gives you a way to provide a little bit more complex examples for your users, and also just let users try out a few things right here in the editor. All right, and now with that, we are basically done with our component. So you can use it on any of your documentation pages like this. You can pass to it the code that you want to display. And again, because we're using Tailwind, you can customize it to whatever your look and feel that you desire. It doesn't have to stay this style, right? You basically have full control over the layout and the styling of this live code editor. All right, so that will be it for this video. All of the code that we wrote today will be available on GitHub. Check for the link in the description below. And also make sure to check out some of my other videos if you haven't yet. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.